In the autumn of 1866, something terrifying was happening in the town of Montauban. People were vanishing from their sickbeds in the middle of the night, leaving nothing but cold sheets and open windows. At first, the disappearances seemed random, until someone noticed a chilling pattern. Every single missing person had shown signs of illness in the days before they vanished. Even more disturbing were the accounts from those few who stayed awake through the night, watching the streets through their windows. They all described the same thing: a tall figure in a plague doctor's mask, moving silently between houses, as if searching for something. Or someone. A local journalist named Henri Dubois thought he was simply investigating missing persons, but as he followed the trail of disappearances to an abandoned clinic on the edge of town, he was about to discover why the sick never returned, and what it truly meant when the townspeople whispered about the doctor's cure. In the autumn of 1866, a journalist named Henri Dubois arrived in Montauban carrying a leather satchel filled with newspaper clippings. For the past 3 months, he had been tracking a series of peculiar disappearances across southern France. What had initially seemed like isolated incidents had revealed an unsettling pattern. In each case, the missing person had been ill or recently recovered from sickness. The local authorities had dismissed these disappearances as unfortunate coincidences. People who were sick sometimes wandered off in their delirium, they said. Bodies were rarely found, but that was hardly unusual in the French countryside, with its dense forests and deep ravines. But Henri had noticed something the authorities had missed. In each town where someone vanished, locals reported seeing a tall figure in dark robes walking the streets at night. Some said it was a monk from a nearby monastery. Others claimed it was death itself, coming to collect the sick. But one detail remained consistent. The figure wore what appeared to be a plague doctor's mask, with a long, curved beak. Henri's investigation had led him to Montauban after he discovered records of an abandoned clinic on the outskirts of town. The building had originally served as a hospice during the cholera outbreak of 1832, but it had been shuttered for decades. Yet somehow, despite its abandoned state, locals avoided the area entirely. When Henri asked about the clinic, they would quickly change the subject or hurry away. On a gray Monday morning, Henry made his way down the overgrown path leading to the clinic. The 3-story stone building loomed before him, its windows dark and shuttered. Vines had claimed much of the facade, their tendrils pushing through cracks in the mortar. The front door hung slightly ajar, its iron hinges thick with rust. The interior smelled of decay and something else, a sharp chemical odor that made Henri's eyes water. His footsteps echoed on the tiled floor as he moved through the entrance hall. The walls were lined with dusty portraits of stern-faced doctors from another era. Their eyes seemed to follow him as he passed. In what had once been the administration office, Henri found stacks of medical records scattered across the floor. Most were routine documents, patient intake forms, supply orders, death certificates. But as he dug deeper, he discovered newer papers mixed in with the old ones. These records were written in an unknown script, the strange symbols arranged in neat columns across the yellowed pages. The dates on these mysterious documents spanned the last 30 years, long after the clinic had officially closed. Even more disturbing were the crude anatomical drawings that accompanied the text. They showed human bodies with impossible modifications. Extra limbs grafted onto torsos, organs rearranged in ways that defied medical science. As Henri photographed these documents, he heard something moving on the floor above. The slow drag of footsteps, followed by a wet, sliding sound. He quickly packed away his camera and pressed himself against the wall, listening. The footsteps continued their slow progress across the ceiling, accompanied by what sounded like labored breathing. Henri knew he should leave immediately, but his journalistic instincts compelled him forward. He found the stairs and began climbing, wincing at every creak of the wooden steps. The second floor was a long hallway lined with patient rooms. Most of the doors were closed, but one stood open near the end of the corridor. The smell hit him first, the overwhelming stench of decay mixed with chemical preservatives. Inside the room, metal tables held what appeared to be bodies in various states of dissection. But these were no ordinary cadavers. The corpses had been modified, their limbs rearranged and stitched back together in grotesque configurations. Some had multiple arms sprouting from their chest cavities. Others had their internal organs exposed and reorganized, held in place with copper tubing and crude mechanical pumps. Most horrifying of all, some of the bodies showed signs of movement, a finger twitching, a chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. These weren't just dead bodies. They were experiments, and somehow they were still alive. Eerie's hands shook as he raised his camera to document what he was seeing, but before he could take a photograph, he heard footsteps in the hallway behind him. Slow, deliberate steps, accompanied by the soft rustle of robes. He turned to see a tall figure blocking the doorway. It wore a black leather plague doctor's mask with dark glass eyes and a curved beak. Its robes seemed to shift and move, as if they were part of its body rather than mere clothing. The figure tilted its head, studying Henri with an almost clinical detachment. Then it spoke in perfect French, its voice carrying the formal tones of another century. It asked Henri if he had been feeling unwell lately. Had he experienced any fever, aches, or difficulty breathing? Before Henri could respond, the figure moved closer with unnatural speed. It reached out with a gloved hand, and Henri felt an icy sensation spread through his body from the point of contact. His legs gave out, and he collapsed to the floor, unable to move or speak. The last thing Henri saw was the plague doctor looming over him, speaking softly about the pestilence and how fortunate it was that the disease had been caught in time. Then, darkness took him. 3 days later, the local police discovered Henri's camera and notebook abandoned in the clinic's entrance hall. They organized a search of the building but found nothing. No bodies, no evidence of experiments, not even the strange medical records Henri had documented in his notes. The upper floors showed no signs of recent activity, only decades of dust and decay. Henri Dubois became another unexplained disappearance in the region. His newspaper published a brief article about the missing journalist, but the story was quickly forgotten. The clinic was demolished the following year to make way for new construction. But in the years that followed, more disappearances were reported across southern France. Each time, witnesses described seeing a tall figure in a plague doctor's mask walking the streets at night. And each time, the missing person had shown signs of illness in the days before they vanished. The figure became known as Le Médecin, the doctor. Some said it was death itself, come to claim the sick. Others claimed it was the ghost of a plague doctor still trying to cure the diseases of centuries past. But those who studied the pattern of disappearances noticed something even more disturbing. They were spreading, moving steadily outward from Montauban like a disease seeking new hosts. And always, before someone vanished, there were reports of strange sounds in the night. The rustle of robes, the tap of footsteps, and a voice speaking in archaic French about a cure for an unseen pestilence. If you're enjoying these stories, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed yet, so you won't miss the next tales. One night, in a small rural hospital, a veteran paramedic responded to what seemed like a routine call, an unconscious man found on the roadside. But within just 24 hours of bringing that patient through the emergency room doors, every single person inside that hospital would face a fate worse than death. This is the story of how a simple act of helping someone turned an entire medical facility into a nightmare that had to be erased from history. It was close to midnight when veteran paramedic Harry Johnson received the call about an unresponsive man found on County Road 23. After 15 years on the job, Harry had developed an instinct for which calls would be routine and which would be trouble. This one made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. His partner Jessa took the wheel while Harry reviewed the dispatch details. A truck driver had spotted what looked like a body in the ditch. No signs of a vehicle crash, just a man lying face down in the grass. The location was about 20 minutes from Millbrook Regional, the only hospital within 50 miles. The rural setting meant backup was always far away, but tonight that isolation would prove catastrophic. The night was unusually cold for September. Their ambulance headlights cut through a thick fog that had settled over the countryside, making the scene feel more ominous than usual. When they arrived, the truck driver was standing well back from the body, his flashlight beam fixed on the motionless form. Harry noted how the driver kept shifting his weight, eager to leave. Something about the scene had spooked him badly. The man was wearing office clothes. Dress shirt, slacks, dress shoes, but they were caked with mud and torn in places. More concerning was the complete absence of a vehicle, wallet, or phone. It was as if someone had simply dropped him there. Harry approached with his kit while Jessa grabbed the stretcher. The first thing Harry noticed was the skin, pale with visible black veins spreading across the exposed neck and hands. The man's skin was cold to the touch, but when Harry checked for a pulse, he found one, extremely slow but present. No obvious trauma besides some scrapes and cuts. The man's breathing was so shallow it was barely detectable. Most disturbing was a half-healed bite mark on the patient's shoulder, visible through his torn shirt. Harry had treated thousands of patients over his career. Overdoses, car crashes, heart attacks. But something about this one was different. The black veins, the cold skin despite the pulse, the strange bite wound, none of it matched any condition he'd encountered before. Following protocol, they loaded the patient into the ambulance and began the drive to Millbrook Regional. The fog grew thicker as they drove, reducing visibility to just a few feet ahead. 10 minutes into the drive, the patient's finger twitched, then his arm. Harry was documenting vitals when the man's entire body began to convulse. But this wasn't a normal seizure. The movements were too coordinated, almost purposeful. The patient's eyes snapped open, revealing bloodshot whites and dilated pupils that seemed to reflect light like an animal's. Before Harry could react, the man lunged forward with unexpected strength, teeth bared. Harry barely managed to dodge backwards, but the patient's teeth grazed his forearm. Jessa heard the commotion and radioed ahead to the hospital about a combative patient while trying to maintain control of the vehicle in the dense fog. The patient's movements were jerky but powerful, like a machine operating on damaged circuits. What happened next defied everything Harry knew about human physiology. The patient sustained injuries that should have incapacitated him, a dislocated shoulder from fighting the restraints, multiple fractures from the force of his own movements. But he showed no sign of slowing down. His skin remained ice cold, but he fought with the energy of someone in a manic episode. By the time they reached Millbrook Regional, it had taken both of Harry's arms and most of his strength just to keep the patient restrained. The small rural hospital usually dealt with farming accidents and elderly care. Nothing could have prepared them for what was coming through their doors. The ER staff was waiting with restraints when they arrived. Dr. Harrison, the overnight attending physician, had assembled a team of 6 people to transfer the patient. During the struggle to move him from the ambulance stretcher to a hospital bed, one of the nurses was bitten. The patient's teeth tore through her protective gloves like they weren't even there. Blood from the patient's mouth mixed with the nurse's wound, a detail that would prove crucial hours later. Dr. Harrison's initial examination revealed more disturbing symptoms. The black veins had spread further across the skin, forming web-like patterns. The patient's blood pressure was barely registering, yet he continued fighting against the restraints with impossible strength. Traditional sedatives seemed to have no effect. Most concerning was the patient's complete lack of response to pain. He had broken his own wrist fighting the restraints but showed no reaction. 3 hours after admission, similar symptoms began appearing in both the bitten nurse and 2 other staff members who had been exposed to the patient's blood during the struggle. Dr. Harrison ordered an immediate quarantine of the ER, but it was already too late. The first patient had broken free of his restraints during a shift change, attacking 3 more staff members before security could subdue him. Even after taking multiple gunshots from hospital security, the patient continued attacking, until severe head trauma finally stopped him. Harry had been assisting with other patients in the ER when his arm began to itch. The small graze from earlier had developed black lines spreading outward from it, forming the same web-like pattern he'd seen on the first patient. His head felt heavy and a fever was setting in. When he reported his symptoms to Dr. Harrison, the doctor's face went pale. They both knew what it meant. The infection was spreading. The hospital's security protocol for infectious disease was simple: seal the emergency department until CDC officials could arrive. But by sunset, half the ER staff was showing symptoms, and the infection had spread beyond anyone's control. Those in the advanced stages had to be restrained after attempting to attack others. The hospital's security doors had been sealed, but inside was chaos. The infected staff members exhibited unnatural strength, continuing to move and attack even after sustaining injuries that should have been fatal. The transformation was horrifying to witness. The infected didn't just die, they changed. Their movements became erratic but purposeful, driven by an overwhelming urge to bite and infect others. The few remaining uninfected staff barricaded themselves in the pharmacy, watching through windows as their colleagues transformed into something inhuman. As night fell, the sound of helicopters approached the hospital. Men in hazmat suits breached the building, but Harry never saw what happened next. The fever had taken hold, and his consciousness was slipping. The last thing he remembered was an overwhelming urge to bite, to tear, to infect. His final coherent thought was of all the patients he'd saved over his career, and how many people in this hospital would now die because of the thing he'd brought through those doors. 3 days later, a small article appeared in the local paper about a gas leak that had forced the evacuation of Millbrook Regional Hospital. The facility was closed indefinitely for repairs. The actual events were documented in a classified report, stored in a secure facility alongside other files about similar containment operations. The report noted that the initial infected patient was never identified, and the source of their infection remained unknown. In a sealed laboratory thousands of miles away, a sample taken from the hospital was added to a collection of identical samples, each labeled SCP-008. Researchers continued their work, trying to prevent the very thing they were containing from ever being created in the first place. Meanwhile, in redacted incident reports, Millbrook Regional became just another statistic. Containment Site 47, one of many facilities permanently decommissioned due to infection. There you have it. Fates worse than death. If you got chills from these stories, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you're not subscribed yet, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next terrifying SCP tales.